Disco.
Are we live? Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to this week's edition of Weekly Witness, the June 24th edition. I'm your guest host, not Scott Atnip. I'm Bea Moorhead, sitting in for Scott, who is working in East Texas, doing a home remodel or restaurant project with youth from the Methodist Church. And today's topic is continuing the legislative wrap-up that we started last week. This week's we're focusing on disaster response legislation. With me is Josh Houston. I think I'm also supposed to say that you can also tune into this on podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite podcast platform, and it is also being shared on Facebook Live and YouTube. And today's sponsor is Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. So today we are talking about disaster legislation. That's kind of an interesting new topic. We haven't often had a legislative session. We had the characterization disaster legislation. Why did we have that?
Well, more than half the state's population lived in a county that was declared a disaster. Hurricane Harvey, of course, hit at the very end of August of 2017, and we had a major city, Houston, Texas, where about 25% of the state's population lives in that metro area. That experienced unprecedented flooding with unprecedented rainfall, and of course, the economic costs were huge.
Sure. Do we have any of those numbers in economic costs?
Sure, about 125 billion with a B in damage, which is about one half the size of the state budget, actually.
That's right. Now that you say that,
to give you some idea of the scope of that, and then the loss in gross state product, which is economic right. Activity that did not occur because of the storm, that did not occur, but was lost, is about 3.8 billion, according to the comptroller's office.
And so let's take a second and define disaster, because I think we have been throwing this term around a lot lately. There's a couple of ways we can talk about disaster, but I like two definitions that I've come across recently. One is the definition that the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program uses. They say an event is typically characterized as a disaster when it causes widespread disruption to daily life from which a community, individual, or organization could not recover without outside assistance. And then the other definition from the World Health Organization is a disaster is an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. So, given those definitions of disaster, we had a lot of bills that we characterize as disaster bills. Can you kind of explain what constitutes a disaster bill?
Yeah, we could have probably categorized even more if we had really sat and thought about it. There was about 170 already, though, so I thought that was a good place to stop. So when the 86th legislature convened in early January of this year, it was the first time they had the opportunity to since the storm hit.
Hurricane Harvey.
Hurricane Harvey hit, specifically. And that hit in late August of 2017, about 3 months after they had
just gone home, right?
Yeah, and that's not necessarily though, because over the interim, really, there was a process of that really over the interim required some study to be able to get ready for the legislature anyway. So over that interim, we had the Governor's Commission to Rebuild Texas that was appointed, and they wrote a report with recommendations entitled Eye of the Storm, which you can easily get online. The General Land Office, another executive agency, wrote another report more specific to the duties of that office, and it had 18 recommendations for legislation. That's called Hurricane Harvey, Texas at Risk. And, there were numerous legislative committees that also received what are called interim charges or directives from the presiding officers, the speaker, lieutenant governor, depending on if it's House or Senate,
Right.
studying the various things under the jurisdictions of those committees. And they also held numerous hearings all over the state. And then they also wrote interim reports with recommendations for legislation. And then lastly, exactly how democracy is supposed to work. You had a number of bills that came about just because legislators firsthand experienced the storm, their constituents firsthand experienced the storm, and things really came up from the local level from those experiences that became legislation as well.
Right, which is just how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, exactly. This is one of those areas that, was really not partisan, really not super controversial. It was really about the policy, and this is just personal opinion, but made it kind of fun to work.
Sure, yeah. Well, and there's one other report you could mention. The little Texas Interfaith Center for Public Policy wrote a report.
Yeah, I was actually going to when we got to.
All right, so just to say, and probably we weren't the only ones too.
No,
There's a lot of work was done evaluating what happened in that storm. Fair to point out that while that was happening in Houston, there were other kinds of disasters happening in other parts of the state.
Oh, sure.
We've had parts of the state experiencing drought, experiencing fires, floods here in Central Texas.
Tornadoes,
and straight line winds.
Which gets you to a legal definition of what is a disaster as far as like Texas is concerned. And I don't know the exact number, but it's a threshold amount of money.
Right,
and
exactly.
damages that is uninsured.
Oh,
in order to
interesting.
In order to meet the federal definition.
Okay.
So
all
right. An uninsured threshold that the state has to meet in order to get a federal declaration.
Okay.
And kick in those various provisions.
But so as a result of Texas being kind of an accident-prone state, a disaster-prone state, we did end up with all this legislation. 60 bills, that's a lot. Can you kind of give us a high level?
Yeah, it is. And in a way, you could even think of it technically the way that bills work, there was over 170 filed. And the strategy that's very common is to take the same bill and file it in the House and the Senate.
Sure.
So when you think about 60 bills that finally passed, that's just the vehicle. A number of those had companion bills.
Okay.
So if you're kind of trying to measure a passage rate, it's really high. Probably upward of half the ones that were filed ended up passing in some form.
Wow, that's a lot too.
Yeah, if you think about the failure, the process is designed to kill bills.
Right.
Unless there's consensus.
So pretty broad consensus that these bills needed to pass.
Yeah, and that doesn't even count. We're still kind of assessing because it's hard to assess how many caught rides as amendments.
Sure, okay.
It's kind of a hard thing too. So anyway, the point of all that is to say it was a high passage rate. Just kind of to make the point about the urgency and the importance of this issue for legislators.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so what are I know you've kind of broken out categories of bills. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit what happened?
Yeah, and so over the next couple days to weeks, we're going to be kind of releasing and publishing online.
Yeah, we tried to do a blog post and it's just
summarizing
too much.
Nearly 60 bills was just overwhelming amount. And so these categories might change a little bit, but broadly, kind of the top line one is administration and coordination.
Okay.
Because when you think about a disaster, it's so interdisciplinary. If you think about you have committees of jurisdiction. So you got one committee is studying the electric grid, right, in the legislative process. You have another one doing insurance. You have another one doing healthcare and hospitals. You have another one. You have another one doing transportation and cars. My point is that in a disaster, all that's affected.
So silos become problematic.
Silos become extremely problematic.
Okay.
And so the question really I think the first bill we want to highlight is really at the top of it is how do you go about coordinating those things? In which state agency is best positioned to do it? And the answer that came about in House Bill 2794 by Representative Jenny Morrison is let's try the university system, which is different, right? Often you have a state agency tasked with one particular area, but there were so many different state agencies that are implicated, so many different private industries, so many different nonprofits, so many different areas of policy that get affected in a disaster. Let's bring in the expertise of one of our top tier universities and use the infrastructure that exists. They picked Texas A&M The Texas A&M AgriLife Extension is already there. So if
Right,
you're thinking about,
sure.
A lot of emphasis was on Houston.
Right.
But the Gulf Coast went from Corpus to Beaumont that was affected by the storm. I mean,
And AgriLife, of course, is in all 254
exactly.
counties.
They had
Sure.
this existing
Sure.
infrastructure that was already present in these rural communities. You have the expertise of the Forest Service whenever you have things, and so you can deploy them
Sure.
for other kinds of disasters that aren't like flooding, but the Bastrop fires. Or the droughts that are obviously a big agrarian disaster,
Right.
so that happened as well. So there was a kind of a logic to bringing in the expertise of so many of a university because of all the different expertise present, especially if one of your big, and this is one of the big top line things, a lot of the legislation to come out of this disaster, this legislature, required more study and more report because the answer
Even after all those reports.
even after all those reports, I mean, a lot of lawmakers are like, well, we studied this to death. You hear that sometimes
Sure.
on any number of issues. Yeah, you didn't hear that on this issue. I mean, it was an issue where there are so many different sub-issues that require so many different stakeholders to kind of get and do more work that they were not afraid to pass study bills, and they were not afraid to pass work groups or task forces or various groups of people to get together to work on complex and thorny problems.
Sure, which is great.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly a good thing too, because I mean, bad policy is almost worse than continuing to work proactively on good policy. So I think that's exactly what.
Well, what about the faith-based community? There were we had a bill, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be like to a lot. So there are actually a lot of these bills that touch and affect kind of nonprofit relief agencies.
Okay.
And we can talk more and more about those for a while. I think the biggest one that we'd like to highlight because we worked on it, and this was the report that you talked about earlier. Actually, I should back up even further.
Okay.
Before we ever did that report, there was a legislative committee that did a study that was having hearings, and we were asked
That's right. I remember that.
Yeah. The chair of that committee asked us to produce some people that were doing faith-based disaster relief because they needed information about what was going on.
Right.
And we were very happy to help produce some of our experts to help that committee.
But it showed that legislators weren't sure how to get that information.
After it was over, it kind of made us think about, well, how much money did we spend?
Yeah.
And how many volunteer hours? Is there any way, how would you ever track that across the religious plurality that is our state and our nation? So we did a report called Time and Treasure, Faith-Based Response to Hurricane Harvey. And I don't know about you, but I was personally shocked.
Yeah, I think we were all really surprised.
At the amount of money. I would have thought tens of millions,
Yeah.
And it turned out it was
hundreds of millions. That's right.
Over $211 million was spent just in Texas, just on Hurricane Harvey, just by our faith-based disaster relief agencies.
Right.
And that were the ones that had capacity to respond. I think we polled 40 of them.
Yep.
23 responded, and a number of them said, hey, we've already moved on to the next disaster. We don't have staff for you to do it.
That's right.
Which was really interesting. I know we had over 500,000 volunteer hours.
Yep. And again, that doesn't count all of them. We know.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I think, and here's kind of the top line for it in Texas. Well, not just Texas, across the nation, the federal government will allow states to use that private money and those private volunteer hours.
The volunteer hours, they count towards your FEMA match.
Right.
And
if you can count.
If you can count them, that's right. And when in talking to the national disaster response folks, we know that most states have trouble counting them. That we weren't alone. So the bill that we came up with was in many ways model legislation for other of our faith-based colleagues to bring forward.
We certainly hope so. I mean, House Bill 3616 by Representative Todd Hunter, the representative from Corpus Christi.
And who's sponsored in the Senate?
And sponsored in the Senate with Senator Lucio, also
Senator
a coastal.
That's right.
Sure. If the Rio Grande Valley had gotten hit, there'd be
with
just
even more
issues.
conversation.
Yeah, I know. So two very interested legislators for their districts sponsored this legislation that goes to coordinating the effort of those 40 some odd different faith-based disaster relief agencies.
Right.
It's kind of a let us help you bill because it is a problem for government to say, report to us your private spending to a bunch of church organizations. That's weird.
Yep. On the other hand,
in Texas's budget process is what I know personally. But the way in an interim you would do what you call a budget execution is you have to pull something from some other fund to put it to a new use, and that requires all the big three: lieutenant governor, and speaker doing it through the LBB, of course. But that's a problem, right? I mean, you're moving money from one fund to put to another thing. What if they could count money already being spent by private entities to help draw down those federal funds quicker without having to rob Peter to pay Paul? So no, I mean, I hope that our members will be just as excited as we are about this. I have a feeling from conversations with a few of them that they are. So this is one that I'm really happy about.
Yep. So another big topic seems to have been consumer protection. What kind of consumers are there in a disaster?
All kinds. So this was one of those areas that I didn't expect to have a category on this, and yet there were enough bills that there totally was, and probably then some. So many of you may have heard about the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. If you haven't, that's a thing that the Attorney General already has power over.
Sure.
It's one of the many things that it does is price gouging. So I know in every storm, you have a news cycle. The news cycle talks about heroic stories,
right?
But then there are often the bad stories.
Looting and price gouging. Looting, two things we hear about every time.
Every time. And so the problem in Texas was what is price gouging? How do you define it?
Oh, okay.
How do you define it in order to prosecute it?
Okay.
And so a lot of states would have a percentage. So if the price of the goods before the storm was X,
and then after
the storm it became Y,
sure,
let's just go ahead and fix it, because at some point you have real supply and demand market forces at
play. Right.
And then sometimes
I imagine those vary depending on the good or service being
absolutely
offered.
And then sometimes you just have what's price gouging, and the problem is, how do you draw the line between those two things?
Right.
So a lot of states just kind of say, okay, let's have an objective threshold, so it's not like subjective to I feel like it was
the way you're saying that makes me think that's not what we did.
No, that's how it was.
It is what we did. Okay.
I can't remember the exact number. I think it was 15%, but there were some changes in the bill along the way. I'm going to look at before I say it.
So it's an objective percentage.
But we have fixed a percentage to it.
Sure.
That's a thing.
That's a big thing.
It's a big thing whenever you pull it out of salvage and it's not. Often when you go to resell parts, that's a problem too, if it's going to flood damage a vehicle. So there's a number of reasons where you want to better track this with a VIN number, so we've kind of updated that.
Okay.
And then on consumer protection, I think we'll talk about that in equity though.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Flooding and the biggest single category of concern.
Well, it was a major area. I think it's probably the most expensive. Is the way I would certainly feel safe about saying it. The administration doesn't necessarily cost too much money.
Yeah.
Building major infrastructure does. And so one of the things that the legislature did is they tapped what is often you hear in the press as the rainy day fund. It's called the Economic Stabilization Fund.
Right.
They tapped about $1.7 billion with a B from it, so nearly $2 billion.
Well, it was a rainy day.
Right. I mean, they're not going to spend it on that, but they did, and it's to pay for flood control projects and repairs. There are several sub funds that we can get into that aren't. We'll just write them down for you. There are sub funds for various different flooding projects.
Now, is this something that voters will have to approve?
Yes. So that was Senate Bill 7 that's the enabling legislation.
Okay.
Some of it they don't have to, but some of it they do.
Okay.
And for the part that they do is HJR 4, and that passed and will go to the ballot, go to the voters. And
what does that do?
The provision, as part of the thing called the Flood Infrastructure Fund, having to do with making loans to local governments at below market rates for flood projects. So I'm not exactly sure why part of it requires a constitutional amendment and part of it didn't. I know our Constitution is very restrictive on certain things.
Just kind of a sidebar here. A lot of this stuff ends up having a lot impact on local government, and
a lot.
and we know that the Congress passed a legislation, the DRA, last year that was intended to provide incentives to local governments as well. One of the things it seems like is probably a continuing story is how a state like Texas, with 1,100 municipalities, how we get local governments the information so that they can take advantage of the programs that are made available to them.
Yeah, no, that was a major theme throughout legislation.
Okay.
Is that we have 254 counties, 1,100 municipalities. They are not all resourced the same.
Right.
So that's an equity problem in its own kind of way.
Sure.
Between rural and urban and
big and
suburban
small,
and big
and
and small, and how many resources in your tax base and all that. So one of the things, like a major theme, you saw this in several of the big kind of not technically omnibus bills, but big
major
Senate
bills.
Bill 6, House Bill 6, House Bill 7, House Bill 5. There were a number of these kind of big, and a couple others I'm not even recalling at the moment, that had to do with administration.
Okay.
Where various guides and model contracts were required to be produced
For
to
local
help
government.
local government be able to do these
Got it.
things in a more uniform way. And
Well,
also to help them with the lack of resources like staff they often have.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that Texas Impact, with our connections to local congregations, will be looking for ways to get that information out into local
Certainly.
communities.
Yeah,
as well.
I think that'll be one of the big things. I mean, there are a number of another themes, a whole lot of task forces,
Okay,
work groups that got created. And
the one in our bill.
The one in our bill is just one example of probably 5 to 10.
Oh wow. Okay.
Maybe I think 10 is safer than 5 even, actually.
Okay.
Double digits perhaps. A number of different work groups across different sectors that will need to actually communicate with each other. I think we're going to find throughout the interim, as these work groups get to work, a lot of overlap and need to even talk to who would have, I think we may find ourselves caring about the business advisory council's work.
Sure.
And vice versa.
Sure, because the faith community is embedded in the local. And just to be fair, speaking of obviously it's not our bill, it is Representative Hunter's bill, and we're very grateful to him for.
Of course.
But the one that we worked the hardest to make sure it passes.
Well, I meant that in the sense of we being the faith community at large, who's going to have to participate in the faith-based task force that has been created for that work. So,
okay, so flooding, lots of big stuff on flooding, including, that's the only one that the public's going to have to vote on, right? Is the legislation related to flooding?
There's 2, actually. The second one has to do with how you go about calculating property taxes. Because obviously when a storm has knocked, your house has been flooded or your roof has been knocked off, whenever major damage to your structure has occurred, your property's been devalued. And it's not always clear how much, right? Both the appraisal tax entity, but also the property owner, where it's like, well, a percentage of your house is damaged, and then you assess the amount of damage, and then you get an exemption for the year until you get it repaired, because obviously there was a real effect on your property's value.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what about public health? I know you had said there was a little bit of nexus there.
Yeah, public health is always a major thing. I think the biggest one I'd like to highlight, and I'm trying to find the exact bill number, Senate Bill 982 by Senator Lois Kolkhorst, creates a plan for the emergency shelters to be able to better care for people with special medical needs. So I think this is one of the most heart-wrenching things. I know if you're a local mayor or those tasked with deciding whether or not to evacuate.
Right.
One of the toughest choices there is, how somebody's going to pass away. How do we minimize that? Is the risk greater if we stay? Is the risk greater if we leave? It is not always clear because you don't know what the weather's going to do, or you don't always have all the facts at hand, and you got to make a decision quick. But the bottom line is you have to evacuate nursing facilities, hospitals. There are fragile people.
Fragile people, that's right.
And even in disaster, kind of no matter what you do.
Right.
So there are things government can do to try to make that better.
So that was the biggest one of the public health.
Yeah,
things.
having TDM, which is now housed at Texas A&M, really created a plan.
Anything related to waterborne disease like Zika or anything like that?
Yeah, so there were a couple of small bills.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. And this was, of course, Senator Lucio, who had Senate Bill 1113 and Senate Bill 1312. In the Rio Grande Valley, there were a shortage of this is the technical term, certified vector control applicators.
What does that mean in plain English?
Well, I'm just going to call them mosquito sprayers.
Got it. Okay.
I don't know if that's the technical term or not, but that is certainly finding ways. So around the same period, while everybody's focused up on Houston and the flooding up there.
Sure.
There was some flooding in the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, it's a flood-prone area.
Well, that's right.
Around the same time period that this tropical virus called Zika had kind of made its way up, and there are some others that very much keep the Department of State Health Services awake at night.
Right.
But the most recent one was the Zika virus. And so having to try to control the mosquito population that spreads those diseases.
Yep.
These two bills were filed and passed to try to address that issue and control the mosquito population.
And speaking of Zika, I mean, one of the things that we know more and more, and World Health Organization actually just put out a report about this last year, climate change is related to disaster. One of the ways it's related is the public health community throughout the world has rising level of concern that diseases like Zika will become more prevalent in a changing climate. Did Texas have any climate legislation? I asked rhetorically.
Well, did we file some? Individual legislators did file legislation.
Okay.
House Bill 100 by Representative Eric Johnson.
Now Mayor of Dallas, Eric Johnson. Congratulations.
Yes, there was a special election up in that area.
That's right.
And then House Bill 928 by Representative Rafael Anchia.
Okay.
So the first one would have required state agencies to plan for climate change. And then the second one would have created a climate change commission to look into
similar to some of the states like North Carolina that are doing that same move.
Yes, those bills did not receive hearings
at all.
Not at all. No, they did not have a hearing. I mean, they didn't. I mean, we can talk about the politics of that.
Sure.
Right now, it's a challenging term for Republicans. But I don't want to be bleak. No damage was done either. So we had so two things about that. No damage was done, really.
Okay.
And then the second thing is
an interesting
let's make
point.
The second one first.
Actually, an interesting point.
Resilience is not is a word that we can all seem to agree on.
And an interesting point is that TDM now being at A&M is where the climatologist is. So the people who are talking about resilience already at A&M.
I mean, and if the problem is semantics, okay, fine.
Sure.
Let's call it resilience. Let's look at the fact that we are having more frequent and more intense natural disasters and begin to prepare.
Exactly.
And that's one of the very encouraging things that I've seen out of the talk is we're not just going to rebuild, we're going to rebuild in a way that is more resilient so that doesn't happen again.
You said that, lots of forward thinking,
Yeah, and that forward thinking is happening no matter what we call it. So let's not be completely negative about it.
Sure.
And also the other point I wanted to make was no damage was done. So one of the major strategic moves that we as a society have to make is to reduce fossil fuel usage and carbon emissions. And one of the easiest ways,
renewables, I suppose.
Well, and one of the most strategic ways to do it, before you address the transportation infrastructure, you need to address the electric generation infrastructure. And if you can, the more and more you can move your fuel mixture to renewable energy and away from fossil fuels, then it then becomes easier to move your transportation infrastructure towards more electric powered vehicles.
Exactly.
Generation, 34% transportation.
Sure,
and
so
the rest is industry.
Yeah.
So 38 plus 34 is
Right, more than half.
Yeah, more than 70% actually. So I mean, so that's would be a huge progress. So the reason I go into all that is to say that Texas has been a leader in wind energy for quite a while.
Right.
This goes back to a decision made in Senate Bill 7, which was, I think, 1999. Yeah, when we deregulated the electric power grid in Texas, one of the deals was a renewable portfolio standard. And since then, we've far exceeded those goals in the production of wind energy.
Sure.
We have wind in West Texas. We have wind on the coast.
And now solar, too.
And increasingly solar power, yeah. I mean, the expense of those panels have just plummeted.
Yep.
Which is important because that means that the cost of purchasing them has gone way down, which means the amount of energy you produce will be profitable in a lot shorter time frame. Right. So again, there were a couple of attempts to how do we want to say this in tax abatement bills. So one of the things that Texas does is for all industry, not just renewable power, not just electric generation, but for things like wall bars, we have tax abatement programs that local communities get to decide on. Chapter 312 and 313 for those of you who are nerdy and like the tax code. One of those was renewed, and as that. Not by Representative Murphy, but by others, to amend that bill to discriminate against renewable energy and try to carve it out. Those attempts failed, fortunately.
And in small part, thanks to the members of the Texas Impact Rapid Response.
Oh, absolutely.
Phone calls.
Yeah. So thank you if you were the Texas Impact Rapid Response team. If you were not, please consider.
You can join it, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those things where in real time, I mean, I remember on this bill, the lobby really thought, this is the wind energy's lobby that we were in conversation with, really thought the vote count was about 16 to 15 in the Senate, where this amendment was going to try to be attempted. One vote, and they were very nervous about it. The bill did not come up on